In 1993, Charlie Ward didn't just win the Heisman Trophy, he obliterated the standard for what an elite college quarterback looked like. He completed 69.5% of his passes, threw for 3,032 yards, 27 touchdowns, and just 4 interceptions, finishing the season with a 157.8 passer rating while leading Florida State to its first national championship. That wasn't hype, that was precision, control, and dominance. And yet, when it was time for the NFL to respond, the silence was deafening. Ward wasn't a reckless runner hiding behind athleticism. Across his career, he threw 49 touchdowns to 22 interceptions, averaged 7.6 yards per attempt, and proved he could beat defenses from the pocket. On top of that, he was also an elite college basketball player, averaging nearly 5 assists per game, ranking top 10 all-time at Florida State in assists, and setting the school record for career steals. Intelligence, vision, leadership, the exact traits the NFL claims it values most at quarterback. So how does a Heisman-winning national championship quarterback with flawless efficiency get told he's a 3rd to 5th round pick? That's the question we're answering today. This is Old School Sundays, where we revisit the stories the league quietly moved past, expose the patterns they never corrected, and tell the truth the history books softened. If you care about forgotten greatness, uncomfortable facts, and real football history, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, because this one only gets harder to ignore from here. By the early 1990s, the NFL had a very specific idea of what a safe quarterback looked like. And it wasn't about arm strength or football. It was about control, about comfort, about who decision makers felt resembled leadership. And in 1993, Charlie Ward walked into that unspoken framework and quietly shattered it. But here's where the story starts to bend. Ward didn't fit the narrative that followed many black quarterbacks at the time. Reckless, raw, dependent on athleticism. Instead, he fit something far more threatening to old assumptions. He was calm, analytical, and visibly in control. The kind of quarterback who didn't need validation from the sideline to command a huddle. The kind who made it obvious that decision-making wasn't the issue. And historically, that made evaluators uncomfortable. Because when a black quarterback succeeds without fitting the stereotype, without being labeled a project or a scrambler, it forces a harder question. If the performance is flawless, the leadership is undeniable, and the results historic, then what exactly is left to critique? That tension followed Charlie Ward long before draft night ever arrived. And as dominant as his resume looked on paper, it was already being quietly reinterpreted, not as proof of readiness, but as something to be explained away. And that reinterpretation would soon define everything that came next. By the time Charlie Ward finished his Heisman season, the conversation around him quietly shifted, and not because of anything he put on tape. The discussion was no longer about accuracy, decision-making, or production. Instead, it drifted into vague territory. Intangibles, fit, projection, words that sounded analytical on the surface, but historically carried far more baggage when applied to black quarterbacks. Ward's numbers made it impossible to question his command. He didn't just protect the football, he elevated everyone around him. Florida State trusted him to manage games, control tempo, and make pre-snap decisions that mirrored what NFL offenses demanded. This wasn't improvisation, it was orchestration. Yet, evaluators began framing his strengths as curiosities rather than qualifications. He was described as quiet, as reserved, as someone who didn't fit the traditional mold. And that phrase mattered, because traditional had never been neutral when it came to the quarterback position. For decades, black quarterbacks were evaluated not on whether they could lead, but on whether they made decision makers comfortable. Confidence could be read as arrogance. Independence could be reframed as stubbornness. And Ward didn't help himself by refusing to perform humility for approval. He openly stated that he deserved to be a first-round pick. Not demanded, stated. The same confidence celebrated in other quarterbacks was suddenly seen as a red flag. Instead of being praised for knowing his value, Ward was quietly repositioned as someone who might be hard to manage. That's where the double standard sharpened. When white quarterbacks struggled, they were labeled works in progress. When Charlie Ward dominated, he became a question mark. Not because of what he couldn't do, but because of how effortlessly he did it without fitting the image the league was accustomed to trusting. And once that shift happened, the outcome was almost predetermined. Because when the conversation stops being about performance and starts being about comfort, history shows who usually pays the price. And for Charlie Ward, that price would be revealed the moment the NFL was forced to put its evaluations on record, in public, on draft day. By the time the 1994 NFL draft arrived, The league had already decided what Charlie Ward was worth, and more importantly, what he wasn't. This wasn't confusion, it wasn't oversight, it was positioning. Privately, the message to Ward's family was blunt. Despite being the reigning Heisman Trophy winner and national champion, teams indicated he was viewed as a third to fifth round prospect. Not because of production, not because of accuracy, but because of uncertainty. Uncertainty about whether he would play football, uncertainty about how he fit, uncertainty that never seemed to apply when other quarterbacks selected in the first round, not as leverage, as self respect. And that single line in the sand changed the power dynamic. Suddenly, the league couldn't control the narrative. They couldn't humble him with a late pick, a backup label, or a developmental tag. So instead, they tried something else. They called his bluff. What made this moment so revealing wasn't that Ward went undrafted, it was that the league allowed the reigning Heisman quarterback to slide without resistance. No team moved up. No owner overruled a scouting department. No best player available argument surfaced. The silence was coordinated. And here's the part history often skips. The NFL had spent decades insisting black quarterbacks needed to prove that they belonged. Charlie Ward proved it conclusively, and then refused to beg for acceptance. That combination made him inconvenient, because once a player refuses to accept diminished value, the system has only two options: elevate him or erase him. Draft night chose erasure, and while the league framed it as Ward's choice, the truth was far less comfortable. The NFL didn't lose Charlie Ward to basketball, they pushed him toward it, because allowing a black quarterback to walk away on his own terms was easier than confronting why he deserved more in the first place. But the consequences of that decision were only the beginning. When the NFL stepped back, another league stepped forward. And the contrast couldn't have been sharper. In 1994, Charlie Ward was selected 26th overall in the first round of the NBA draft. Not as novelty, not as a gamble, but as a point guard trusted to run a professional offense. No demands to change positions, no lectures about temperament, no uncertainty about leadership. The evaluation was simple. Can he play? Can he think? Can he lead? The answer was yes. That difference matters. Basketball saw Ward's intelligence as an advantage. His vision became a strength. His calm demeanor wasn't questioned, it was welcomed. The same traits the NFL treated as ambiguities were immediately translated into value. And within a few seasons, Ward proved the evaluation correct. He carved out a 10-year NBA career, became a reliable floor general, and eventually started games in the NBA Finals. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when a player is trusted. What's striking is how little adjustment was required. Ward didn't need to be developed. He didn't need to be protected. He simply needed opportunity, something the NFL insisted was risky to provide. Meanwhile, the NBA never asked him to justify why he belonged. They assumed he did, then let performance confirm it. And the irony deepened. While Ward was stabilizing playoff rotations in New York, NFL teams were cycling through quarterbacks with inferior resumes, lower efficiency, and far less proven leadership. The league didn't just miss out on a player, it watched another league validate what it refused to acknowledge. That validation quietly undercut every explanation the NFL had offered. Because if Charlie Ward was capable of managing NBA pressure, NBA playbooks, and NBA locker rooms, then the question stopped being whether he could handle professional football. The question became why football never wanted to find out. And the league's discomfort only grew as Ward succeeded, because success without their permission has a way of exposing decisions they'd rather keep unexamined. As Charlie Ward settled into his NBA career, an irony began to take shape that no one in the NFL could ignore, even if they never acknowledged it publicly. In New York, fans and media started calling Charlie Ward the best quarterback in the city. It was said half jokingly, but the meaning underneath was sharp. While the Jets and Giants struggled year after year to stabilize the most important position in football, the man they never drafted was calmly directing playoff offenses a few blocks away at the Madison Square Garden. This wasn't hype, it was observation. Ward didn't just survive in the NBA, he earned trust. Coaches relied on him to protect leads, control tempo, and make the right decision under pressure. He became a steady presence on deep playoff teams, respected for his preparation and composure. Those are the same traits NFL teams swear they prioritize at quarterback, yet somehow deemed insufficient when Ward displayed them in football cleats instead of sneakers. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because the joke wasn't really about football, it was about judgment, about how easily decision makers dismissed a black quarterback who didn't fit their preferred storyline, only to watch him thrive in another league that placed a premium on the exact qualities they claimed to value. Ward didn't have to dominate scoring columns, he didn't have to be flashy. He just had to be reliable. And reliability, once again, followed him everywhere except the NFL. The contrast became impossible to miss. New York trusted Charlie Ward to run an NBA offense in the postseason. Meanwhile, NFL teams cycled through quarterbacks who were constantly described as learning, adjusting, or still figuring it out. That patience was never extended to Ward, not because he lacked ability, but because he lacked tolerance for being undervalued. What made this phase of his career so revealing wasn't that Ward proved the NFL wrong, it's that he never tried to prove them right. He didn't chase validation, he didn't circle back. He didn't ask for another look. He built a successful professional career without football's permission, and in doing so, quietly highlighted how flawed the original evaluation had been. And eventually, the NFL would make one last attempt to rewrite the narrative, not with an apology, but with a phone call that came far too late. Years after the NFL made its decision, the league tried to reopen a door it had already closed. During Charlie Ward's rookie season in the NBA, a message quietly surfaced from the Kansas City Chiefs. The idea was simple on the surface. Ward could return to football as a backup quarterback to Joe Montana, a safe role, minimal risk, no pressure to lead. And that detail is the tell. The NFL wasn't calling to right or wrong. It wasn't calling to give Ward a fair evaluation. It was calling because circumstances had changed, not because its beliefs had. The offer wasn't about seeing if Charlie Ward could be the guy. It was about seeing if he would finally accept a diminished version of himself. Ward declined. That decision often gets framed as proof that football wasn't his passion, but that reading conveniently ignores the timeline. When Ward needed opportunity, the league hesitated. When the league needed depth, suddenly his ability made sense again. The invitation arrived only after he had established value elsewhere, and only in a role that came with no long-term investment. This wasn't reconciliation, it was revision. By that point, Ward had already done something rare. He proved he could thrive in professional sports without accepting disrespect first. He didn't need to return to football to validate his resume. The resume had already been validated, just not by the people who originally refused to read it honestly. And this moment reveals the quiet truth at the center of the story. The NFL was never unsure about Charlie Ward's talent, it was unsure about control, about whether he would wait his turn, about whether he would accept being told what he was worth. When he didn't, when he chose autonomy over access, the league moved on. But the precedent his choice set didn't disappear with him. It lingered, and in subtle ways, it would shape how future black quarterbacks were evaluated, negotiated with, and ultimately trusted or not long after Ward had already made his exit. And that legacy is the part of this story the league still hasn't fully reckoned with. Charlie Ward didn't fail the NFL, he forced it to show his hand. He was a Heisman winning, national championship quarterback who refused to beg for opportunity, refused to shrink his value, and refused to accept a role designed to make him comfortable being overlooked. Instead, he chose dignity and he built a successful career on his own terms. That's why stories like this matter. To everyone in the Old School Sundays community, thank you for watching, for questioning the official version of history, and for supporting a channel that isn't afraid to revisit the truths the league moved past. If this story made you think, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know whose story needs to be told next, because history doesn't correct itself, we do it together.